So early in the morning. My name is Vikas. I'm from Georgia State University, as I guess you probably know by now. So this is a new paper I've been working on, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. So this is actually joint work with Juan-Pedro Gomez, who is in Madrid, Spain, at IE Business School. Kasra Hosseini, who was a student there, and now he's in Netherlands in Eindhoven University of Technology. And Manish is a colleague of mine at Georgia State. So we wanted to basically understand an important issue that is, even though there is a lot of work on ESG, ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance, and it's obviously one of the most researched topics right now in finance. We'll see how things go, because in the US, the new administration probably doesn't think too much about the ESG part, so we'll see how it goes. But the idea of this paper is very simple, that traditionally we have only had financial goals that we give to our executives, so they need to maximize shareholder returns. But now we have to also worry about ESG performance, so we want these executives to also care about meeting those ESG goals. So in a world where you have two types of goals that are given to an executive that are less than perfectly correlated, how should you think about the optimal contract? So this is what the paper is about in a sentence. So why is this important? Well, it's not just our imagination. We know that it's becoming increasingly common for executives to have ESG metrics included. So this is actually from our data, which comes from ISS Incentive Lab. By the end of 2023, about 50% of the executive compensation contracts had at least one of E, S, or G in their contract. And this is especially, you can see a big jump from 2015 to 2023. This is the end of our sample period. And there can be multiple drivers of this phenomenon. It could be that the society wants the firms to be more socially responsible. The institutional investors might pressurize the firms to focus more on ESG. The regulators might want to do that. So there can be all kinds of reasons, which is not something that we look at in this paper. We basically start at the point where ESG is included in the contract, and then take it from there. And the research on ESG pay is very limited, which is kind of surprising for us, because even though there's so much work on ESG, I said, people haven't really looked as much on the compensation side. We know that if you actually have the ESG goals, there's this new paper which shows that it reduces emissions and improves the ESG rating. So it does have an impact on the ESG performance. And then there is a prior work which shows that when you improve ESG performance, it actually can increase firm value. So there might be some correlation between ESG performance and financial performance. Although there is a lot of debate in the literature, some people take the view that doing good does not mean doing well. So, and some people think the other way around. So even there is no consensus. What's also interesting is that when you introduce these ESG goals, this new working paper shows that it doesn't really change the total compensation of the executive. And typically these ESG metrics carry a very modest weight in the compensation contracts, which basically you might think may not matter that much, because if the weights are small, they shouldn't make a difference. But I'll show you the effects are quite large. And these metrics, what makes ESG metrics different from financial metrics is that they can be discretionary. Because when I say you need to just improve, social welfare, it doesn't. It's not very clearly specified. What do you really want to achieve? Sometimes, so they can be poorly specified. They can be discretionary. So some people have taken a view, like people like Lucien Babchuk, that these metrics are simply a way for the executives to extract rents. So if you don't do well in financial terms, you can say, well, I was just focusing on ESG, right? So it's a cop-out for the executive. So how do we reconcile these apparently contradictory views? So ESG goals, as I said, are different from traditional objectives because they are difficult to quantify. They're relatively novel, so we don't have a long history of these, which makes it even harder for us to assess them. While standard objectives like EBIT or TSR, EBIT stands for earnings before interest and taxes, and total shareholder return, these things we have been using for ages. So we know what to expect. So what is the idea? The idea is now, I like to give analogies because that makes it easier for us to understand. When we think about hiring an assistant professor and tell them you have to only do teaching, the incentives are to just teach well, and that would basically get you through promoted, tenured, whatever. But then we tell them, no, we also want you to do research. And we know that teaching and research could be correlated, but not perfectly correlated. So now when I introduce research as well, then you have to somehow think about how to change the incentives to do teaching for them to optimally allocate effort to research. So the classical way we do that is we reduce the incentives to teach so that they can focus on research as well. And that's how they maximize the objective function. So essentially, that's exactly what we are going to do here. We're going to see when you introduce ESG goals, do you have to decrease the incentives for the financial goals? And the incentives for the financial goals will be measured by something that people have used in the literature, which is called pay performance sensitivity. So how much pay do you get for 1 unit change in the financial performance? Okay. Now, you could have also done the same problem by increasing the incentives to improve the ESG performance. But measuring incentive on ESG performance is not feasible because we don't have long history. So you can only do the incentives on the financial side. So I'll show you how we measure the incentives. So essentially, the idea is that the manager has limited time and limited effort, and there are competing demands on the manager's time and effort, so they have to allocate their effort in an optimal way. And so how do you design the contract so that they can do that? So as I said, so one important thing here is, suppose if teaching and research, let's go back to my example, if teaching and research were perfectly correlated, in which case, if I ask you to do research, well, it doesn't really change much because by doing research, your teaching is also improving. So they're perfectly aligned. But when they are not, so suppose they are negatively correlated, then the effect has to be much larger because I have to reduce your incentive much more, because if I focus on research, it takes me away from teaching. So what we are going to do is we are also going to measure the complementarity between these two goals, financial goals and ESG goals, okay? And so our predictions are, if they are substitutes, then they should be, the incentive should decrease, which means if they are negatively correlated, then I have to reduce the incentives on the financial side for the executive to exert effort, okay? So we will look at both introduction and removal, because if you remove the ESG metrics, you should find the opposite effect. So thankfully in our sample period, we have cases of both adding as well as removing the ESG metrics. So initially we will start with a dummy of ESG metrics, and later on we'll split the sample into addition and removal. We have a couple of more predictions, three more predictions. We basically, sorry, I missed one more thing here. So there is a second prediction here that you could also have said, oh, instead of teaching 2 courses, you teach 5 courses, okay? That would be another way of increasing the goals for the assistant professor. But we show in that case, you don't have the same effect because it's just doing the same type of task, more of that. So there is no, because the standard tasks are all measurable and they are perfectly correlated. So you don't see the same effect. So what you really need is an idea of multitasking where the 2 goals are less than perfectly correlated. Okay, so this is something important to keep in mind. So we'll actually test this prediction. So you can think of this as a placebo test, that if you just add more financial goals, you should not see the same effect. And then we have 3 more predictions. We basically also see if you introduce just one, so initially we will work with just extensive margin, whether you have any ESG metric in your contract. Then we will also use a continuous variable to understand if you increase the number of ESG metrics, is the effect much bigger? So it's asking like, you can publish any paper. That's one way of asking people to do research. Or I can say, I want you to publish 3 papers to get tenure. Then that requires obviously much more effort. So you have to reduce the incentive more. And then we will do the last 2 predictions, which are based on how complementary are the ESG goals with the financial goals, and how much noisy are the ESG goals. So the more noisy they are, the more you have to reduce the incentive. Okay. So because if they become exactly measurable, then they become similar to the financial goals. Okay. So what we want is to measure 2 things, measurability and materiality or complementarity of the goals. So how do we actually test this? We basically have very detailed data from ISS Incentive Lab, which is at the contract level for each executive in a firm in a particular year. We know which are the metrics included for their compensation. And these metrics on the financial side could be either accounting-based metric like ROA, or it could be like stock returns. So these are performance vested options, where I'll show you one example where you will say if you have 10% return, you will get so many restricted share units. And if you increase your performance between this and another 15%, then you will get additional so many units. So it's like an option, but it has a contingent claim, right? And so what we'll do is we'll basically use this idea from an accounting journal, accounting paper, Bettis et al., where they provide a methodology on how we can estimate the pay performance sensitivity. So pay performance sensitivity is essentially the slope. It simply tells me if you improve your financial performance by 1%, how much dollar value of compensation you get. Okay, so this is very standard and people use this in the literature. The unique thing about this paper is they did it for performance vested options. Earlier, prior literature actually looked at time vested options, which were different. Okay, so these are performance based and we are going to just use their methodology. So in case I run out of time, I'll quickly first tell you what the results are and then I'll show you the analysis. So what we find is that when you introduce ESG goals in the contract, there is indeed a drop in the dollar delta. By how much? About $5,000, $4,600, which is about 20% of the average. So it's economically large. And it doesn't happen when you just introduce standard goals. So this is only when you introduce ESG goals, ESG metrics, that's when you see this effect. And when you introduce more number of ESG metrics, this drop becomes larger. It's not linear. We actually even run a piecewise nonlinear regression to show that this is actually nonlinear. And then the last 2 things we find is that when you have non-material ESG, then you have a larger drop. So when those ESG metrics are not financially material, then there's a larger drop. And when they are non-measurable, then also you have a larger drop. So basically it's consistent with the hypotheses that come out of our model. So the paper has a full model, which is, I don't have the time to show, but it's there, you can take a look at it. The data, as told you already, is from ISS Incentive Lab, which gives you the contractual details. Other data is standard from CompuStat and CRISP. Okay, so what's interesting is that even ISS Incentive Lab prior to 2018 was not keeping track of the ESG goals. So they only started classifying this in 2018. So what we did is we, instead of assuming that nobody ever had a ESG goal in their contract, we actually backfill the data. And to do that, what we do is we basically take these keywords from this paper, and then they have these terms that they give in the contract, and then we ourselves classify the ESG metrics before 2018. Okay, so a contract is classified as ESG related if it includes at least one ESG word. Okay. So what are the examples of ESG metrics, just to give you a sense that these are not completely crazy, right? So environmental side has food waste, water recycling, carbon market, like the standard kind of things. On social side, you have employee retention, diversity, client retention, employee satisfaction. So these make sense, right? And then on governance, you have a bunch of, standard things, again, board diversity, anti-corruption, etc. So how do we measure the dollar delta? The dollar delta is simply, this is stock price times number of shares, this is the dollar value, and the delta is the slope that we estimate. How do we estimate this delta? The percentage vest is the amount, the portion of the award tied to a particular metric. So think of it like the weight that you give to the metric. So this is this is from our sample actually. So it shows you how you actually give these performance vested options. So in this particular example, the metric that you are using is 3-year total shareholder return, stock return, relative to the peer group. So compared to your industry, how much is your performance? If it is up to 0.3, you get nothing, and at 0.3 you get 3,000 restricted stock units, and then from 0.3 to 0.5 it goes to 10,000 and so on. Okay, so we have these kind of contracts for every for the executives based on different financial metrics. And then we use a simulation. Why are we using simulation? Because our measure of pay performance sensitivity is forward looking. It's basically trying to estimate what would be the likelihood of this executive getting these units based on their future performance. So for that, we require historical performance to estimate these things, and we then compute the delta based on that. The same kind of thing is also on the ESG side. So this is an example again from our sample where you look at CO2 emissions. And so if you reduce your emissions up by 0.47, you get so many units. Okay, so it's exactly similar to the financial performance, except that for ESG performance, we don't have historical data. So we cannot estimate the pay performance sensitivity, if you like, for the ESG case. So basically what we are doing is we are trying to see what happens on the financial side when you introduce ESG goals. Okay, how do we proxy for measurability and materiality? So measurability is a dummy variable that takes a value of 1 if the ESG performance is has explicit benchmarks like I showed you here. So clearly, if you are measuring CO2 emission reduction, then it has to be measurable. Otherwise, you can't do this. And then materiality comes from this SASB. So SASB is an agency which basically looks at all these different goals and says whether a particular type of ESG metric is financially important for an industry or not. So for example, if you are in oil and gas, emissions are important, but it might not be important for a software industry. So we basically look at materiality. So here you see that for sustainability, air travel is not material for software, but it may be material for another industry. Okay, so this is at the industry level. Just to clarify, materiality is not available at the firm level to us. So in the end, we have about 22,000 observations for which we can estimate the delta, and these are the observations we are going to basically do the empirical analysis with. So just to give you a sense of how big is the dollar delta, the average dollar delta is about $24,000. So when I said that when you introduce ESG metrics and it reduces the dollar delta by 4,600, is 20% of this value. ESG metric, the average is 0.382. That means on average, about 38% of the contracts have any ESG metric. And then we have contracts which have only E metric, only S metric, only G metric, and then some combinations. So here is the regression that we run to estimate how the dollar delta changes with the introduction of ESG metrics. So to do that, you have this whole kitchen sink of subscripts, which basically means that we are going down to the metric level to estimate these things. And the advantage of that is we can include high dimensional fixed effects. What that means is if David is, we introduced a ESG metric for him, we want to see how his incentives change with the introduction when he is working for the same firm in the same year. We compare before and after, essentially. So this is the regression we are running first. We include year fixed effects, executive firm fixed effects, and metric fixed effects. So you see that the dollar delta goes down by 4,500 roughly. But then we include executive firm metric award vesting fixed effects. So these are the highest dimensional you can use. Even if you do the most stringent one, you see the estimates don't change dramatically. They basically are in the same order of magnitude. And this is the number that I quoted to you earlier, that $4,600. So when you introduce, what this number means is when you introduce at least one ESG metric, the dollar delta goes down by $4,600. And what it means visually is, so I wanted to just see whether this shows up in the data, or it's just like regressions with fixed effects, kind of hard to sometimes figure out what's going on. So what we did is we pulled out an observation from a sample and then just plotted the delta. So you can see that when you introduce ESG metric, you get this green line. So it clearly shows that the slope actually changes. It reduces with the introduction of ESG metrics. So this is for one of the executives in our sample. Then we look at additions and removals, as I mentioned earlier. So here is the additions and here are the removals. So 2/3 of the observations are related to additions and 1/3 are for removal. So what we find is when you add the ESG metric, the dollar delta reduces by about 4,000. And when you remove it, the dollar delta actually goes up by about $6,000. So we test whether these two are different from each other. And it turns out that statistically they are not different from each other, even though the magnitude wise, this one is about 50% higher. Then what we do is we say, okay, instead of adding ESG goals, let's just add more financial goals. Do you get the same effect? And the answer is no. So if you just add more standard metrics, you don't see the same effect on dollar delta. But when you do the ESG metrics, you find the same effect. So it's important to keep in mind that introducing ESG goals is distinct from just adding more standard goals. Then we look at, if you introduce more ESG metrics, is the effect much more pronounced? Okay, so that's our third prediction. And the answer is yes. When you introduce a continuous variable called number of ESG metrics, it shows that for each ESG metric you add, the dollar delta comes down by about $880. So this suggests that this is linear. Then later on what we do is we actually create these dummies for 1, 2 to 3 and 4 or more metrics, and you see that the effect is not linear. So as you keep on adding more and more ESG metric, every additional ESG metric does not decrease the dollar delta by the same amount. That's what it means. Then the last thing we look at is materiality and measurability. So we want to test whether the ESG metrics that you are introducing, is it material or it is measurable? How does that change the result? So now what we are using is the number of non-material ESG and number of material ESG. So when you introduce more non-material, you find that the dollar delta reduces much more. And when you have more non-measurable one, then the dollar delta reduces more. Okay. So the same effect is not there for material and measurable ESG. So basically all we have done is taken the ESG metrics and put them into two groups. And then we are running this regression. Okay. All right. So then people asked us, even though we initially just wanted to think about this as an optimal contracting framework, people said, okay, can you show whether when you add the ESG goals, does it really, when you reduce the incentives, does it also lead to better ESG outcomes? So it's like asking, if I tell the assistant professor that I'm going to reduce your teaching so that you can focus on research, do they really produce research? Okay, so that's exactly the thing we are trying to test here. So what we do is we basically take the ESG metrics that are introduced, number of ESG metrics, the dollar delta, and then the interaction of the two. So the idea is, if the dollar delta is reduced with the introduction of ESG metrics, then you should see an improvement in the ESG score. And the answer is yes. So when dollar delta goes down, the ESG score improves with the introduction of ESG metrics. And this is true for the overall ESG score, but it's also true for E, S, and G. The G one is not significant, okay? So, but it does show a negative sign, but it's not significant. Then we also did it for the number of ESG metrics, and you get the same result. So we did a bunch of robustness checks. I have like 1 minute. I can just tell you that we include firm and executive level controls. Of course, you can argue that firms choose to introduce ESG goals. So there is a selection issue. So what we do is we model that and then create a match sample, and then we repeat our analysis. We use alternative ways of classifying ESG. We use a staggered DID. We take care of outliers. No matter what you do, the results are robust. So I'm going to just skip that in the interest of time. So I have like 30 seconds. So let me just quickly summarize the main idea of the paper is very simple actually. It's just trying to understand that when you give multiple goals, multiple tasks to the executive, how should you think about designing the optimal contract? And what we are saying is that if these two tasks are substitutes, they are negatively correlated, then you have to reduce the incentives for the old task in order for the executives to exert effort towards the new task. And that's what our results show. And for this, you have to keep in mind that the more new tasks that you add, then you have to reduce the incentives more. And the less material and less measurable are these new tasks, you have to reduce the incentives more. And that's what our paper really shows. So thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
So your focus is really on the E and S component of these metrics, not on the G component. The G typically have different meanings. G is governance.
Yes, but I think we are agnostic. We did not have we didn't have strong priors about which one will have a bigger effect. But since you brought this up, and I knew somebody will bring it up, so we also did this heterogeneity. And you're right that the effect for G is actually insignificant when you break it down into only E, S, and G. So, but starting out, we did not have any priors. We just wanted to say any metric you introduce, whether it's E, S, or G, we just kind of pooled them together. Mm-hmm. And then in the paper, this is now in the appendix of the paper, we are basically showing that the effect is strongest for E, followed by S, and then G is not significant.
G is managed by the board rather than by the CEO, so you wouldn't incentivize the CEO to improve governance.
Right. And now, so I was presenting this in UNSW at David's school, and Ron Masulis asked me, oh, why don't you look at here I showed you the results for all executives pooled together. So he suggested one thing, that why don't you break it down on CEO, CFO, COO, and then see who is the one who is most affected. And his prior was that it should be the chief operating officer, because they are the ones who are really implementing this. Mm-hmm. Guess what? We find result exactly consistent with his intuition. So we ran it separately for CEO versus COO, and we find COO has the biggest effect. That's something we have to add to the paper.
Did you look at the total compensation?
Yes. So we looked at the total compensation as well. I think I don't have it here, but it's in the paper. The total compensation is unaffected, as shown by the paper by Ganchev, Giannatti, and Hober. So there is no change in the total compensation. And there is no change in the time vested delta also. So this is also reported in the paper.
So I have a similar paper, but instead of looking at ESG, we look at political ideology.
Okay.
Other than that, much of the empirical setup's the same, in that we have pay performance sensitivity. can you be sure that its ESG is not just proctoring for something like political ideology in terms of more left-wing CEOs will pursue, I guess there's going to be a lot of overlap. A left-wing CEO is more likely to pursue ESG goals or have them written into the contract just by the nature of the alignment.
Yeah, sure. So that's an interesting, so I like to look at your paper, I haven't seen it. But I think our motivation was these are explicitly included in the contract, while the political ideology is something that is like a preference of the executive. So it's slightly different. So it could be that the ESG goals are correlated with the political ideology, as you said. So if you are red leaning, then I'm not likely to introduce ESG goals. So this could be correlated somehow with the political ideology, and in which case you would get the same kind of things. But the difference here is our starting point is the addition of these ESG metrics. Why they are added, we are kind of agnostic about that. It could be related to political ideology. It could also be related to the preferences of their investors. As I said, it could be related to the society. So if you're in Europe, people are more ESG oriented than in the US. It could be the regulator. The regulator here might be forcing the firms to be more ESG oriented. So there can be many, many reasons, which makes it harder to really pin down why ESG is there in the first place. So I think that's a very challenging question to answer. So we kind of copped out from that and we just said, okay, let's just take the contract as given and then we just see how should we think about the optimal contract.
Was this just US firms or is it worldwide?
These are US firms, yeah. The accounting paper that I mentioned in the related work earlier on, that's actually using international data, but they do different things. They don't look at this incentive stuff at all. So we can technically actually extend this study to international. So we have international data because ISS actually gives you both US and non-US data. So in our to-do list, we want to later on extend it to other countries as well. Any other questions? Did it make sense to you?
Yeah, of course. I have one other question. It might be diving too deep into the econometrics and also because G came out to be insignificant, which I find very surprising, but also probably good for your story because, I mean, we know G is closely tied to pay for performance, like CEO entrenchment would be a G measure, but it's also very much tied to the CEO's motivation.
Yeah.
So did you have to do, I guess you don't have to do anything more to separate that out since it's insignificant, but did you encounter any trouble with how you would separate G being mentioned in the contract in a way that's not endogenous to the CEO's incentives?
So we actually just use the terms as laid out by ISS Incentive Lab. We only classified it prior to 2018 when they didn't do a job of classifying it. These are actually from ISS Incentive Lab. We don't really do this job. They classify. But later on what we did is, for robustness, what we did is, of course, you are writing a paper. This is a fintech conference. I should have shown that. So we use a LLM as well to classify into E, S, and G. So if you do this LLM-based classification, you still get the same result. So you could take a view that maybe the classification is noisy and maybe there is some endogeneity issues or whatever. So I don't think this takes care of the endogeneity issue. It takes care of the noise in the classification itself. But I don't know how you would. I think to take care of endogeneity issue, you have to somehow then look at some terms which you think are endogenous and throw them out and see if that changes things. That we haven't done because we don't know how you would do that. And if you have any suggestion, let us know and we can try that. But we did try different classification schemes here. Any other questions? Good. Thank you very much, and look forward to hearing from you.